I don't think of myself as an author. I think of myself as a street historian or a community historian first. And the only reason I create books is because it's just to solidify those memories, to lock them in for future generations to find, after all this work that I do trying to excavate these stories. So that's the only reason I write. It's not because I really like to write like some people do. I find it very painful. So my last name is Clement, which is a French name, but my mother was Chinese. And my father was white, Alberta boy, Swedish-Irish mix. And he served in the Second World War. He served in Bomber Command. And my mother and father had a relationship and had me, and I only go back because it just sort of explains like how I get connected to all of this. They never stayed together as a couple, and partly because of my father, who was really damaged somehow by his experience in the war. He was a heavy drinker. He had episodes of violence, and he died relatively young, 58. They broke up, and I wound up going under his care, which was no care at all. And so it really was severed from my Chinese background. So I grew up ostensibly white, and I grew up in the foster home system. But many years later, I never thought I had much interest in history. I never really cared about the dates that the Magna Carta was signed or this, that, or the other thing. But as I got older and I wanted to understand what happened to my father, and I became very much interested in, not in so much war history, but the experience of war and what it's like for a 20-year-old farm boy to suddenly find himself flying in Bomber Command and life and death and losing friends. And so I began to, listen to a lot of documentaries and do research in that area, and became just, fascinated on the experience. And back, I guess it was about 2009, there was an opportunity that came up. There was a special project being done, and they were asking for people to interview the last of the World War II veterans. And I thought, what a great chance for me to actually hear from eyewitness testimony of what it was like to be in the war. And so I volunteered and said I would do some of the interviews here in Vancouver. And the first person they assigned me to was a Chinese Canadian veteran named Leonard Wong. And that interview changed the course of my life. I rediscovered my own roots and history, and also heard this fascinating story of these Chinese Canadians who at the time didn't have citizenship, didn't have the right to vote, and yet who volunteered to serve for their country. And some of them died in the process of that. So I became fascinated by that story, and in fact, everything that I've worked on over the last 15 years now has all had its genesis in the conversations I had with those men, most of them who are gone now, and in the photographs and documents that they showed me. It was those photographs that first led me to discover Yucho Chow. Invariably, when I would ask them questions, I'd always start with easy questions like, where were you born? So I would ask them these questions, and then I would ask them, can I see some photographs? And they would bring out little shoe boxes and Zeller bags and albums. And two things started there. First of all, I began to notice these really interesting studio photographs, all with this unique logo that said Yucho Chow on it. And I would see some that were starting like in the 1917s, 1915, into the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. And I would go to the next veteran and I'd see more Yucho Chow photos. I'd go to the next veteran, see more. And finally, like after the sixth family, I decided, I should look this guy up. Who was he? And there was nothing on him. He was like this ghost, like no photos of him, very little information. I found a little bit on the camera workers website, but very little information. And that started me on this hunt. I thought, this guy's fascinating. And I only knew him, though, as a Chinese photographer. So I'd only known him taking photos of Chinese Canadians, early Chinese Canadians. And what happened was, after, coincidentally, so about 5 years, I would collect his photographs every time I interviewed somebody. I would ask, do you have any Yucho Chow? Sometimes they would know what I was talking about. A lot of times they didn't. But over time, I began to recognize his backgrounds and the furniture that he used. And I discovered a lot of things. I discovered, first of all, he had photographed from 1907 to 1949. So during a really tumultuous period in Vancouver history, the race riots, the Exclusion Act, Chinese Exclusion Act, the Great Depression, the war. And one day I was interviewing the widow of a Chinese Canadian veteran. And the focus of the interview was on her husband. And but as I was getting ready to leave and putting on my coat, I realized I had not asked her a single thing about her own life and who she was. And I knew she had grown up in Chinatown, but that was it. So I said, maybe, well, what about you? Like, you know, what was your family background? And that's when she said to me, oh, and my grandfather was this photographer named Yucho Chow. I'd been searching 5 years of all these interviews, and finally, just because I decided to ask her, it was transformative. And the first time I saw a photo of him, and then she connected me to other members of the family, and I discovered that he ran the studio, as I said, from 1907 to 1949. Then his sons took over until 1986, and then they retired and closed the studio, and they took 5 truckloads of material and negatives to the dump. And all of that material was lost. And, but, so that even made me, I had even more resolve to actually find him and tell his story. So a few years later, I was doing a project called the Chinatown History Windows, where I was taking empty storefront windows and putting up these large murals where I could share different kind of stories of Chinatown. And I dedicated one window to Yucho Chow and some of his photographs, and they were just photographs of early Chinese Canadians. The Vancouver Sun heard about it. They did a story on it on the front page, and suddenly I got all these other emails and from other community groups. So I got an email from a Black Canadian who said, oh, we grew up with those photos in our houses. Yucho Chow was the photographer for the Black Canadian community. Then I heard someone from the Sikh community who said he was our photographer because no white photographer would take our photo at that time. So he documented many of the early South Asian community. And then I heard from mixed race families. And I even heard from Ukrainian families who said, you know, when we came, we were to Canada, there was a pecking order in the white community, and we were at the bottom. We were considered these backward peasants, but yet we found a place at Yucho Chow Studio. So he took a lot of photos of the early Croatian community, Ukrainian community, Polish community, and suddenly it was bigger and better than I ever had imagined it was. And it was sort of like this idea that Chinatown was much more than just Chinatown. And that here was this one photographer who documented all these other marginalized communities. And I did an exhibition of his work in 2019, and that even generated more material. So we had more people coming in with photographs. And eventually I created a book. When I finished the Yucho Chow book, I realized that the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act was coming up, and there was nobody really talking about it. But I had seen, of course, with all these interviews I'd done, the head tax certificates, which each one has a photo on it. And initially, all I wanted to do was an exhibition and call it Portraits of Exclusion, and use the portraiture off these documents. But then I discovered how little was known about the Exclusion Act and what I was discovering about it, that it wound up becoming a much bigger exhibition. Like, most painful thing I've ever worked on, like most heartbreaking story I've ever worked on. But it was all the portraiture that actually initially drew me into this story. It's a very powerful story, but it's a story that was lost. In fact, when we opened the exhibition on July 1st, 2023, I was in another room at the time, and the museum assistants came running in and said, "We need to go out and buy boxes of Kleenex because so many people are crying." I think it was I think they came to appreciate like what another generation had done for them. Yeah, so the exhibition is over now, and we're just finalizing the book, and more stories came in, of course, more certificates came in. And it was painful even writing the book. Like, I just went through all of this over again. I've never teared up so much as I have on this project. So whatever I do next has to be like Yucho Chow, something fun and celebratory versus something that was pretty sad. In the end, the community triumphed. They became like a model minority in many ways, but the price that was paid by those who went before us and whose story we have forgotten was pretty substantial.